Okay, we're good.
Is it right if I sit here?
Yeah, that's fine.
You can see me or no?
Okay, we're good. We're all good.
Are we online yet?
Yep.
Okay, so Wednesday, 2 days ago, we talked about, again, we talked about the well day paper, and which Florian had earlier presented, and I was confused by it, and so I was trying to walk through my thinking about it. And then I had this idea, which I presented on Wednesday, that if you recall this figure here, we had all these voltage controlled oscillators in this big grid.
Mm-hmm.
And I was trying to make sense of it. And I said, well, really, we're just, if I was thinking about one cortical region, it would just be one row of these. And then I said, it's possible that each of these ring oscillators is actually a linear slab in the cortex, and that you have these traveling waves going across the cortex as opposed to around the circle. And so that each slab is sort of, it looks like sort of a direction and velocity controlled signal, right?
It's looking from above, right?
This is looking from above. You're right. Sorry, you're trying. So I said, well, that was a really intriguing idea. And I tried to get my head around it. I said, what does it mean? And how would it work? And it's really hard to think about. It's like I'm bouncing around in this sort of crazy world up here. So I'm trying to make sense of this. And so I have some thoughts about if this were true, if this idea were true, what would be the implications of it? What would it do, and what would the capacity be, and how would I even think about things like what does it mean if this were true? So I want to walk through my thinking on that just as a way of practicing it and seeing what I got wrong, and it's interesting. Matt, you're turning around. He's going someplace else. So again, as Michelangelo just pointed out, we're looking down the cortex. This is your sort of classic Hubel-Wiesel ice cube block from the top. You've got these orientation columns that go across approximately a millimeter. And then there's these orientation slabs, which go in the other direction. And I was saying last week that I've never understood why you'd have these slabs. I've speculated over the years, but now we have a new idea to think about, is that each of these slabs is essentially representing these voltage-controlled oscillators at different peaks, at different phases, like the analogy was the wave in a stadium. So every 100 milliseconds or 120 milliseconds, this whole slab would be oscillating as a voltage-controlled oscillator, but the peak would be traveling back across these waves across the cortex. So how do we make sense of this? First thing I had to get my head around, I kept getting confused because there's two types of cells we're talking about here. One is the type of cells, I call them HW cells, that's what Hubel-Wiesel, right?
So Hubel-Wiesel cells.
These are the ones that they measure from. And the reason I'm struggling with this, because in the voltage-controlled oscillator model, all these slabs are active at the same time. They're all oscillating while the animal's moving or the thing is moving. They're all oscillating. They're all active. Where in the Hubel-Wiesel, if you look at the cells, they put a sinusoidal grading. They say, oh, if the grading is moving like this direction here, well, these cells will be most active. These a little bit less and less and less and less, and there'll be no activity over here. So it's like, well, that doesn't make any sense because we have to have everything active here. So this took me a while to get it in my head that we're really talking about two populations of cells. One population of cells indicates direction and velocity. That's what Hubel-Wiesel measured. A subset of the cells in every mini column, somewhere around 50% or less, have some property that are direction and velocity. So these cells, basically, when something is moving across the visual field, and this we're talking about vision, but it should be the same everywhere. Something moving across, then these cells fire at a higher frequency, and the other cells are less so. But we need to translate that into voltage-controlled oscillator cells, which are really the cells in this paper are referring to, and that's a different population. In that population, while the animal is moving, those cells are, in this case, in this model, there'd be cells throughout this entire grid. Those cells are all active at something close to theta. And the ones that are in the slabs that are associated with the movement are going slightly faster than the ones that are not in the slabs going the movement. So we're really talking about a different set of cells here. These cells are how we're sensing movement and turning that into voltage-controlled oscillation in some mechanism that is yet to be specified. And so I'm going to be talking now, for the most part now, about these voltage-controlled oscillator cells, which are presumably someplace in the cortex, if this theory was correct. And if this is all a big if, this is all like, well, if this crazy idea was true, then there would be these voltage-controlled oscillator cells. I kind of showed it here, up here. I'm pointing out that there's while the animal is moving, there's some theta frequency which all these voltage-controlled oscillator cells are oscillating at. And what it would mean is, if I look at the different frequencies across these slabs, I wrote this as theta plus 8, and this would be theta plus 4, and this one would be theta plus 4. The idea that they become differentially slightly, 4 and 8 just placeholders. They mean nothing. But that this would be slightly oscillating faster than this. But they all go up in frequency. If you recall, one of the requirements here was that as the animal moves, all the baseline thetas go up, but some go up more than others. That was that little figure in that picture which showed that this is the mean baseline theta frequency, which is going up with speed, but then the ones that are in the direction of movement are going up even more, and the ones that are not in the direction of movement are going up less. So this would be like the plus 4, and that would be the plus 8, and somewhere in here we just have plus 6. So that's the first thing. Now, it's interesting to think about these traveling waves going across here. Again, it's like within 100 milliseconds or 120 milliseconds, something like that. Every 120 milliseconds, you're going to have this like, whoop, whoop. There's like these all the cells in the slab are firing at the same rate, but they're just taking turns peaking. So the question then, the thing is like, well, what does it mean to have a traveling wave? Because if you look across this direction, and you can imagine by that, in this whole talk here, I'm going to talk about 8 by 8. I'm assuming what we're really talking about, each of these things is associated with a mini column. And so I'm just going to, for number's sake, which is not a reasonable thing, I'm just going to say 8 by 8. So if I look across the slabs here, and I look at these guys right here, if I look at a sampling on each of these different, I'm going to call these swim lanes, these are just slabs. These VCOs they're all slightly different frequencies, and so they'll be going in and out of phase. Right? So even if I started with them all at the same peak of their phase, and then the wave starts going up, what you see is as the wave goes up, it's going to start deflecting like this because this one's going faster and this is going slower. And at some point they get all mixed up. And so you would have no apparent, very quickly you would look like a quasi and you'd see things at all different phases. So the idea that there's a traveling wave that is moving across the surface, I can't seem to make sense. It doesn't, if you just take the assumptions that these are at different frequencies, and then there'll be basically a theta frequency movement across here, but each swim lane, each slab will be slightly in and out of phase and a slightly different frequency. So depending on how you measure this, it might look like a theta traveling wave because you're going to see at any point in time, how you look at it, you'll see if I sample here, I'll see this traveling wave. But if I sample across here, I won't see a wavefront. I'll see a bunch of things at different points in that frequency. So that's this point over here. So here's my observation. I'm talking about two populations of cells, theta cells and these butyl basal cells. We're not going to see one wavefront traveling across the surface. It's more like you have one wave per swim lane, like you have a pool, and each one is got a wave going down its lane, and the waves are all similar frequency, but there's a divider between them, and they get out of peaks. Now, that says a lot about what would be the mechanism to make that happen, because you can't, well, first of all, there's the question, what would the mechanism make it look like this at all? There has to be some mechanism to say, in this direction, we see different orientations, in this direction, we don't. That mechanism has to exist today. We know this is true. But it says further now that whatever mechanism is making, there's got to be some mechanism that basically says the wave is traveling in this direction. It's not exactly the same wave it's traveling in this direction. So there really can't be any interaction between these two. Well, there can't be any, it can't be tied together in any way because they have to be independent. And there's a question, I was telling Florian the other day, there are cells that have this very linear look to them. I'm trying to remember, I thought it might have been the chandelier cell, I haven't checked that out. But I know there are these cells in layer 1 that have this very strict linear.
They look like a line, but they're inhibitory along a line.
Yes,
sort of.
yeah. So people always talk about layer 1 is the acellular layer, meaning there's no cells in it, but that's not true. Monica Hall said first place he looked at layer 1 is like all these cells in layer 1. There's just not as many of them in layer 1 as other layers, and there's a lot of other neuropil up there. So anyway, this says something. It says like this, a very tight constraint like that could be the death knell for a theory, but it could also be a great way of partially validating the theory because it requires very specifically that there has to be a mechanism for that, and we have to be able to find that mechanism someplace. It might be known. So I wrote that down here. Traveling wave mechanism must be per swim lane, and so that's an interesting, difficult thing to do. So now we have this idea that you have these different waves going across here, all roughly the same frequency, a little bit more, a little bit less, and they're kind of going any point, any two or a couple of different these lanes next to each other, any two lanes in general, coming in and out of phase. Anytime you look at any sets of cells, they'd be coming in and out of phase. So then I said, okay, that's weird. What can I do with this? I mean, what is? And so the next thing I asked myself is, one way we've done this in the past is we've talked about the representational capacity of this, and I didn't even know what to mean by it. What's it representing? How am I going to use this? It wasn't obvious what I would do with this, but I could start talking about the representational capacity of it in some way. So imagine if I just assumed there was 8 little points in here that's not a continuous thing. It's like 8 mini columns and 8 mini columns. And so in one sense, each of these mini columns would be at a different phase from the same frequency, but they'd be slightly in a shifted phase. And so I'm just going to binarize it and say, okay, I'm going to have one of 8 points along here that I can have. It's a little bit of a curve, but a little bit spill over. But let's go for 8 points. So I say, well, there's approximately 8 cells will peak activity at any point in time. So if I assume there's one cell that's peak here and another cell that's peak here, and each of these slabs will have one cell that's at its peak. So really, if I think about the way, there would be 8 peak mini columns at any point in time in this image here. The others would be less than peak. And then you can say, well, how many different ways can you represent that? How many different things can that represent? You can say, well, okay, well, this is pretty simple, right? If I just wanted to look at all the possible combinations of that, it would be 8 to the 8th power, which is about 17 million. So there'd be 17 million different ways that I could pick one column to be active out of these 8 slabs. So I wrote that down here. So the representation is 17 million, and that's assuming you're looking at all 8 at the same time, and you're saying, okay, that unique combination of 8 is a different unique combination. But there's a weird problem here because if you think about it in a very short time frame, let's say you have a pattern like this. You've got this one's peaked, and this one's peaking, and this one's peaking, and this one's peaking, and this one's peaking, whatever, something like that, right? In a short time frame, these guys are all moving, right? And so they're all going to move up roughly the same time because they're all going, and slowly they kind of in and out of sync. But over a short period of time, like a period of one cycle, they're all going to be just lockstep together. So this pattern, in some sense, is really no different. If I remove the high frequency component of it, this pattern is no different than the one shifted down here, which is really no different than the one shifted down. There's really no new information in it other than it's happening 120 milliseconds later. Maybe that's useful information, but it's certainly not, that's kind of limiting in some sense. So I said to myself, well, if I remove that high frequency component and I just assume that all 8 shifts of that same pattern are equivalent for some point of view, then I'd have about 2 million different ways that I could represent, because it's 17 million divided by 8. so it's 8 to the 8th divided by 8. Then there's 2 million different possible ways that I could pick a relative offsets of the peaks. Okay. I don't know if that's a valid assumption. You know, I don't know what computations could be occurring at these sort of 120 millisecond intervals. You know, are different things going on? Is that really critical that at this point in time it's here and the next point in time it's shifted up one bump? Is that something we're going to take advantage of? It could be. I mean, I'm thinking about like the precession type of time frames and things like that. But if I think about most cognitive things, it wouldn't be very important. But I'm not certain about that. So I said, is that a valid assumption? I don't know. Now, the interesting thing now is I said, okay, so you've got a bunch of these bumps that are active. If I sampled any three of them, any three that are active at the same time, they're going to all be at over 20, they're all going to be over 20 degrees apart separation here. And so if I had a cell that looked at all three of those, any three, I could just pick any three of the 8 that are active at any point in time, that cell would look like a grid cell. Meaning, and this is, I think this is what we've been saying. I think that's, I hope I got that right, but that's the basic theory here. And Florian was talking about that.
That's what Neil Burgess and Bush said in that paper. And one can easily do this. I mean, we've played around a little bit with lines just to show that. As soon as if you exclude collinear inputs and the difference between the inputs are at least 20 degrees, then 3 inputs that are at least 20 degrees apart are sufficient to get something that looks grid-like. It's just not near maximum firing rates, and the firing fields are very uneven. Some bumps are kind of, almost died out, and some are very strong.
But which is what we see in the tank paper anyway.
Oddly enough, that is what we see in the tank paper.
Oddly enough, or maybe fortunately enough, that it's
right.
So, because I always want mechanisms that are not precise, right? I want to be able to say some cell needs to know something, and you can subsample from some population, and that'll be good enough. Now, recall, we're just talking about the VCOs here, and in a moment, I'm just going to remind you that associated with each of these VCOs is a mini-column. There's a whole bunch of cells underneath this. So it's not just one cell, there's a whole bunch of cells that are somehow entrained to this VCO signal here. And so we're not even restricting ourselves just like I am sampling from 3 cells. There's a lot of cells that are available to subsample from. I haven't gotten there yet. I'm talking about the representational capacity of the system, assuming there's like 1 VCO per mini column. So I said, okay, so now we're talking here, right? So I was having trouble translating this paper to the anatomy, to this idea, to grid cells. and I sort of there. I'm thinking like, okay, on any point in time when the animal's moving, by the way, recall, this only occurs when the animal's moving. When the animal stops moving, theoretically, the theta rhythm stop. So while the animal, which is fun, I think that's actually good, but while the animal's moving, we might start out with one set of activities here, then as we move, these things are all shifting and drifting in and out, but at any point in time, if you're sampling from some subset of these, 3 of these cells, that cell will be a proper grid cell in the movement, direction, velocity of this thing. It's going to be updating correctly, and it'll be doing what we think of grid cells as doing. Now, this doesn't even propose there is a grid cell. It just says that if I sampled from 3 of these things, then I would get grid-like behavior. And I think, Marcus, you said something a couple meetings ago about maybe that these things themselves are actually doing the path integration in a sense. And I'm still trying to get my head around that because it's a very fast path integration. It's like, I'm not sure if you can illuminate that more, but it's an intriguing idea.
Well, just what you said right there was you pretty much just laid out all the pieces.
I laid out pieces.
Like, movement is causing like the phases of these to shift. Grid cells are essentially just a readout of a few of these. Grid cells aren't doing path integration other than maybe error correcting.
So when I think of path integration, I've always thought of it in the past as, okay, you basically, to get path integration, you need to have a bunch of regular repeating elements that when you combine them together, they give you this unique thing. But I never thought of the regular repeating elements as being super fast like this. I don't still.
The interesting thing is that the actual integration of sort of the velocity-based path integration is in the slight shift in the phase of the oscillators that are a little bit faster than the other ones. All right. So the actual integration, only in one dimension, is in the slight increase in the phase that you get over a theta cycle of the cell that is, directional on the right side. So it is exactly the small shift, right, in the phase that is the actual integration.
But the integration only occurs when you look at multiple ones of them, right? If I just look at that one VCO, it's going at a faster rate. How do I interpret that?
One VCO is equivalent to a 1D grid cell module in the sense that it has a phase that is 1D.
Yeah, but that phase is happening really fast, right? It's happening like 100 every time.
Yes, but that is the whole reason why this can be so compact, right? I mean, you're building an entire grid cell sort of module block with its inputs here, with just like one cell as the necessary input per minicolumn. That is very, very little in terms of what you need compared to what you would need in a CAN only model, for example, right? So the reason why that can be so compact is exactly because of all this timing specificity, because you're doing all of this integration in these waves.
I think obviously I'm understanding it at some level. That's why I'm presenting here, but there's still something that it's different than I thought of it before. I haven't put my finger on it yet, but I'm still very intrigued by this idea that you really have a bunch of 1D things, and it makes it look like you have a 2D thing. Or maybe it would look like a 3D thing. I don't see why that wouldn't work. An interesting question I had, if I was trying to represent space in 3 dimensions, do I need 4 1D grid cell modules? To do 2D, I need to get a triangular lattice. In 2D, I need 3 different vectors, 3 different things. I get if I have 2, I get this other pattern. Right? If I just have 2, then I get this sort of rhomboid pattern here of activity. And as usual, simulator pointed out, and Marcus has pointed out this too, I think, that if I do it like this, then I get this triangular lattice. So I still haven't answered this question. Like, if I wanted grid cells in 3 dimensions, do I need 4 of these to make little?
No, you need
I don't understand what it means.
Face-centered Haxic, face-centered cubic grid is the correct representation for a 3-dimensional space. It's the most
cubic grid.
So yes, so you get cubes, but they're face-centered. So it's a very specific.
I don't know what that means, face-centered.
I can show you the paper behind it. It's a geometry. There's different ways of packing oranges in a box. Right. Volume, and there is one way that is this basically the most compact way.
That's the one that looks like you have the one that's most spatially is you have on a plane you have 3. And then above the next plane up, you have like that one, right?
Exactly.
Little permanents, little triangles.
Correct. And there's ways.
So that's like a tetrahedron, right? That's like the point.
No. Actually, the smallest repeating element is not tetrahedron because that would flip around all the time. So the smallest repeating element is actually a face-centered cuboid.
But if I took the centers of these 4 oranges, they would be a little permanent.
But you cannot repeat this element and build the lattice.
Well, one's upside down.
Yeah, exactly. You need multiple of them, and they need to flip around. Right. So that is not the smallest.
Because I think what I'm trying to do is say, look, it's all about 1-dimensional vectors, and it looks like a 2-dimensional thing because that's what happens. It's not. Right. It isn't 2-dimensional. It just looks like it. And somehow I would like n-dimensional to work the same way too. I guess the question I was getting at is. It's interesting. The idea here, if I sample any 3 of these, it doesn't matter where in here, any 3 active at any point in time, I will get this kind of lattice performance. Now, yes, it could be a little bumpy and a little wonky, but we see that. And the question is, if I sampled more, let's say I was working in a 2D world, and I sampled 4 or 5 of these things, what would it look like down here? Is 3 critical? Do I have to only have 3?
Well, is having grid cells critical?
No, but
if you-
we want to be able to recreate biology, and biology sort of shows grid cell-like features.
in 2D, and 3D is kind of messy. 3D is like very strange, and so
At least the Ulianowski finding doesn't suggest it's maximally compact and it's in the third dimension.
But okay, what in 2D though? What if I'm living in a 2D world and I sampled 4 or 5? Then it wouldn't be very nice either.
Can I propose how you would get to a 3-dimensional grid in this neural layout?
Okay, so I have my idea. I've already mentioned before. My idea is that these guys, these orientation columns, can look 2D, but they can be 3D. They're basically any way the data suggests. I remember I talked about in and out of the plane for vision. So my thing is that these guys represent different. They can represent one-dimensional projections of any n-dimensional space, and the whole thing should work. That's my starting assumption.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess theoretically you could build something like that. But practically, of course, the question is where are those cells and how does that work? So here's an idea, and slight credit to Kevin actually for bringing that up, because it made me look up 2 papers with regards to that. Because I was puzzled a little bit by the anatomy, like the ice cube model is highly, very extremely, stereotypical, like this.
Yeah.
Not really parallel lines.
Yeah.
And, it's like, yeah, maybe there's some.
But you understand, if you realize here, none of that matters.
Yeah, no, I understand. You can bend this whole thing and it's still fine, right? Because it's about the connectivity.
Yeah.
We just, it just helps us think about the elements that we have.
It makes me so I can sit here and put numbers on these things.
Because as Kevin pointed out, in real V1, right, these sort of parallel, tracks of cells that have same orientation selectivity, which, might be multiple neighboring mini columns of the same selectivity, they are interspersed, right, with the ocular dominance columns.
Yeah.
And it has been shown that the cells that are on the edges between these ocular dominance columns are actually disparity sensitive.
Yeah.
So there are cells that code for spatial depth.
Yeah.
So what they did is actually they showed like point patterns to the left and the right eye, and then they proved that if you give them different depth, if you have the stereotactic, I'm missing the right terms for all of this optical stuff, but so if one of them is shifted the right way, then it pops out to the front or to the back.
Yeah.
And there are cells at the edges between those snaking ocular dominance columns in V1 that can do exactly that.
Yeah.
And so you would have a natural mechanism of cells that could potentially provide that input, and you could neatly integrate them because you could use the same theta-based mechanism.
Yeah, I agree with that. I was a little dismissive of that when Kevin brought it up because I was pointing out that you don't need 2 eyes to do this.
Right.
And so that is like an additional mechanism, but it's not I don't want to rely on that but it doesn't matter. I think there are flow detectors cells also in retina and in V1. So, but okay, so that's the same basic idea that there are cells that are detecting motion in and out of the plane, and if I represent those in columns like this, then you're done. I mean, that's all it requires, right? So, but I still have maybe it doesn't bother you, Marcus, but I was under the idea we're trying to get these beautiful little stacking, patterns here, but maybe that's just a fallacy. Maybe in reality, if you just have enough of these one-dimensional things, it's messy and it works anyway.
So so the literal answer to your question of how many of these do you need for 3D path integration is 3. 3 that are sufficiently different from each other. Now it's not going to give everything unique representations, of course, but it's going to be like 3 grid cell modules.
So what happens if I sample from more than 3, even in 2D dimensions? Until I have more of these lines crossing like this.
You saw that in the original Burgess paper. The first oscillator inference one, they show that they build it with like 3, 4, 6, 8 oscillators, and they just show the grid gets better and better.
It gets better and better. But you would also
it relies, of course, and that's really important. And I think that's something you didn't mention, and it's worth thinking about. All of that relies, of course, on a proper theta reset mechanism.
So I don't have a problem with that because I think what's going to happen here is I have a general idea of what's going to happen with the theta reset mechanism. And maybe this is what they've written about. I don't know. I can't remember. But this is how I thought about it.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm going to learn something, I'm going to only learn something when the cells are peaked together. That's by definition. That's the only thing. That's what I'm going to learn. So if I'm going to form some synapses with somebody, it's going to be one of the cells that are all peaked together. Now, if I then want to reinstate that position from a sensory input, right? All I'm going to do is say, I'm going to activate all those cells, and I'm just going to say, I'm going to do it starting now, and they're all going to peak together. And then we'll basically pick up where we left off in some sense. And so you don't require, remember, and the theta derivative goes away when you're not moving. So it's not like we need this thing to keep going and keeping, it's basically saying, all right, starting now, we're all at the same peak, start progressing, and where are we now? Who's active at the same time? And then I say, oh, now if I go back to that position, boom, they're all active peaking at the same time, and then we progress further. So in a different direction, maybe. I don't have a problem with that. It seems to me that would naturally occur, that you resync every time you start path integrating. Every time you have a sensory input which drives this thing that says, we're here, let's get going. Even if I pick the random one to say, I don't know where I am, let's pick a spot. I'm just going to pick some collection of cells that are currently active and say, okay, randomly pick a new location, let's get going. And that'll work. It's very similar to the way we've done grid cells and things. So I'm not worried about that. I do have something I'm kind of worried. I'm confused about. I'm not confused. I just don't know yet. Again, I want to point out that for every pattern that I might recognize up here, these two, there's 8 of them that are shifted that are the same in some sense. They represent the same thing because they're over some period of time. Those 8 patterns are not really going to be. They're going to be tied together over some longer period of time. And the question is, so if I randomly sampled at any point in time, a bunch of cells here, well, there are another set of cells that would have occurred 120 milliseconds later, and they are a very different set of cells, and yet they represent, in some level, the same thing. So I'm confused by that. I wrote that down here. I said there are 8 sets of there are 8 sets.
Separated.
I don't know, what did I recall here? There are 8 sets separated by rows. Rows? Is that important? Yeah, I guess, I'm not sure. Yeah, there are 8 sets of these, separated. For every pattern, for every one of these 2 million patterns, there's 8 variations on them that are occurring. They're basically the same. They basically represent the same location in space, the same sort of grid cell, if you will, but there are 8 sets of them separated by 120 milliseconds.
Yeah.
And so what does that mean? How do I think about that?
There's very, very many ways to build grids from those input cells, right? That's the sort of the conclusion from that.
Well, there seems to be a redundancy here that I would like to understand better.
Yeah, but maybe that actually lends robustness to the system.
It might, or it might represent additional representational capacity, or it might be saying, it might be encoding something. Remember this whole idea that and I have to get back into the literature on this. The idea that they've shown in the hippocampus that you can play back sequences within one cycle. So is this representing a series of events that occurred in the past? I mean, it's weird. I just have to, I bet you if we go back and read that literature about the precession of those recalling of events, it might be related to this or something like that. Anyway, this is mostly what I want to talk about today. I said to myself, okay, so for this to work, this is kind of appealing to me. So now I have a little bit better understanding of how this mechanism with the kind of cells we see, with the kind of cells we're assuming exist, these VCOs, and traveling waves that you could have some really interesting, how you derive grid cell-like properties and dimensions, and what it requires. It requires this sort of swim lane specific theta wave, which is an odd thing. but that's what it requires, and therefore it requires some mechanism for it. So that could be good or bad. We can find that mechanism. We can say, hallelujah, that's good evidence for this. I was wondering, I was thinking about them measuring the traveling waves in hippocampus and cortex. And I was reading the traveling wave, this traveling wave paper, and I need to read it again, because when I read this, I didn't ask myself, would their mechanisms have shown this kind of traveling wave where all these peaks are out of phase here? Would they have seen that? Right. Would they have noticed that? Or were they just detecting that there was a wave going in this direction? Because if I look at the LFP, I'm not sure what I would see. Not sure what I see. If I look at the LFP in this direction, I would see this wave. If I look at it in this direction, I would see them scrambled.
Right, and the problem is, of course, that if we look at actual architecture, like say V1 Cat Cortex, right, it's not really proper ice cube. It's not one strict orientation. That's what I was thinking for a while. Like, does that mean that there is a direction to the theta wave? And yes, there is a direction to the theta wave, like during sleep, like that's what Sinovsky showed, right? Yeah. But the problem is that this direction doesn't align with like some orientation of an ideal ice cube thing, because in reality, there's like these singularity nodes which are like in the ocular cone. So this is, things to me,
this could be the biggest killer of this idea, or it could be the biggest support of the idea. I guess that's a little bit on the fence about it. It's either if this is true, then damn, this is gotta be what's going on. But if this is impossible to have, then let's shoot the whole thing. Because I don't know what it means then.
Here's one other thing that I was worried about. So you now have this nice, 8x8 model, right? I mean, the numbers are, like a little arbitrary, but not completely, because of course we know, as you pointed out, that there's like a 20-degree span between.
20-degree span, right? And putting these, size of mini comms, this really fits. It fits. It's in the
what has me a little bit worried is that one of the fundamental assumptions now is that the theta kind of like repeats at the length of that, ideal cube. And the problem with that is that the math on the speed of the theta doesn't really work out to be on the order of a hypercolumn.
I thought it worked out right.
Because I did like math judging on the speeds of these theta waves that were reported in this paper, I think the one that you were reading.
Yeah.
And I figured that
which one? This one, the hippocampal theta oscillations?
Yeah, I think it's that one.
Remember, I thought it was right, because remember I pointed out in this figure 2 that it turned out to be about 1 millimeter to get a full shift, a full,
yeah, somehow I got to a larger distance than. Maybe we can do the math together.
All right, I did it really quickly by looking at this figure here.
Because mine was off by 1 to 2 orders of magnitude.
Oh, that's interesting.
So you got like
I was looking at this figure here, and I was thinking these guys are these are 4 different rows of probes, and so they're looking at 1 row, 1 row, 1 row, 1 row, and those probes are 0.5 millimeter apart. And if I go from one to the next, it's about 180 degrees, and then one to the next, about 360 degrees. So at about 1 millimeter, I get 360 degrees. I'm back to the same phase. So I looked at that and said, looks good.
I went the other way around. I took the reported traveling speed and applied that over estimates of hypercolumnar size in neocortex, and concluded that I would travel something like, I think it was like, some 40 hypercolumns or something. So it was like off by like 1 to 2 orders.
So how does it make sense? Because this is I get this 360 degrees in 1 millimeter.
We don't need to solve it here, but maybe.
Okay, well, anyway, that's interesting, because I did do that test.
Yeah.
That was one of the first things I checked for, and I'm very quick, reading of this. Maybe I read it wrong. Right. I got an answer right around 1 millimeter. I'm like, holy shit, that's pretty good.
Right. Okay. Good. I mean, like, we're doing the same sanity tests here, right?
So anyway, I thought I passed that sanity test.
Right.
Now the next thing I want to go with this is to start thinking about this in the terms of mini columns. Well, the one thing that's really I wish I had the answer for is what to do about these 8 different sets that are all equivalent. That is a little disturbing to me. I don't know what to do with that. That's why I left with a question mark here, because if I don't understand that, I can get really off going forward here. But the idea is that each of these are mini columns, and so presumably these VCOs are some cell someplace, maybe in the lower regions of the column. I don't know where they are, but they're presumably cells that some subset, small subset of the cells in each mini column, and now other mini columns are are going to be able to, and then the whole mini column has this sort of behaviors associated with that thing in some sense. And now the other cells are going to be sampling from them. And so now it just, like, how do I take all the kind of theories we've had, whether it's like the sequence memory theory, where you have, picking this idea of picking individual cells that have the same meaning within a mini column now, which increases your representational capacity dramatically.
Right.
And all the other things, displacement cells and all these other things we've talked about over the years, how would I try to reinterpret all of that in this context?
That's a lot of rethinking.
But it's just additional information. But I think in the end, it's going to be it's all going to make sense in the end. It's just very confusing initially, but in the end, it'll be sort of crystal clear and interesting. Another thing it's struck me with is, of course, this whole idea about orientation is a problem. But here it's kind of interesting. There's sort of an implied orientation because the movement you're moving to. Anyway, there's a lot of things I don't understand about it, but that's really what I wanted to get at here. There's one more point I want to make, unless someone wants to talk about this further.
I have one thing involving like the capacity of this. I'm realizing that there is one core difference. I've been comparing these to 1D grid cell modules, and that we can kind of reuse all of that, like each of these swim lanes, so they can be visualized as a ring in some sense if you wanted to visualize what its current phase is. But there's a difference, like, and it really became clear to me when you asked how many of these are going to be needed for 3D, and I said 3, and as you add more, what would happen? Florian answered, the grid's going to get nicer. But in the way I'm used to thinking of this, what's going to happen is how big your location spaces are is going to get larger. And larger.
But right. I think I know where you're going.
So yeah, you see where I'm going. Like, as you combine multiple of these, like let's just.
Well, let's go to the extreme. What if you combine all 8? Right? I have to have all 8 bumps.
Yeah.
Then that means this set is only going to become active 1 out of 2 million times. And so that means that the bump will repeat very rarely.
Right. So there's some contradiction here. Where's this coming? How is it becoming better and better grids rather than larger and larger grids?
I think I'm with you. The larger one.
Mm-hmm. The better and better comes through the theta reset mechanism.
I thought it might.
Because the point is that these different oscillators, right? They're obviously, like, you have this phase shift here, right? So that's, I don't know, call it phi, right? And so if you introduce additional oscillator, right? Let's say we already have the preceding one, and so you have grid nodes here and here. If this one is supposed to be optimal, then it needs to align in phase with the other ones, so that you strengthen the grid that you already have. Do you understand that?
They have to be right. They have to be right aligned.
If I didn't have this oscillator, then you would have some grid of some sort, right? And it only improves to the addition of the next oscillator if the next oscillator is with the theta reset mechanism aligned to the correct phase.
But I'm not sure it would be aligned to the correct phase. In this way I've described it here, I think it wouldn't be. I think it would be sort of random, wouldn't it?
Well, the hybrid grid cell model and the oscillatory interference model make the assumption that when the readout cell, the cell that listens to the 2 original oscillators, when this spikes, right, it also resets the theta phase to all the 3 oscillators that are part of it.
Just because it's spiked?
Yeah. So which gives you exactly the problem that you have.
It wouldn't have spiked unless they're already aligned.
No, it's a self-aligning mechanism. So
but why would I spike if they weren't already aligned?
Right. The point is these things, right? They might shift, they might drift, they might not be perfect, right?
Because that's assuming that they were perfect, but they're drifting.
Right. And so the way that they do it in the hybrid model is to actually let the simulation run for, I don't know, a couple of seconds to jigger all the theta phases into a coherent grid. They have a mechanism that automatically moves the phase up or down. It's a heuristic mechanism, depending on how well it would fit the firing of this.
See, there's a fundamental problem here, because I'm trying to take advantage of the fact that these guys are not aligned. And that gives me my capacity.
Right.
And if I just assume that I always want them aligned, then I've lost capacity. If I always say, like, well, this cell's here, and I really wish it was here, I'm going to move it there. Right. It's like, well, that's kind of, I'm losing. The whole point is to know the difference.
Well, you think about it this way, right? So you have, I don't know, like a grid cell, it's kind of like in the sheet, but I'm going to draw it outside of here.
right? And say it gets input from like three different VCOs, right?
Yeah.
So this is my grid cell like readout, right? So minimal model just takes 3 inputs. What you would need for this to work as a proper grid where these things are aligned and it produces a nice perfect hexagon grid, we know that's not true, many are messy, but if it was supposed to be best, then you would need to make sure that every time that this cell fires, you correct for slight drifts in the phase.
Okay, but that's fixing an error. If I don't
continuously every time.
Yeah, but I don't want to do that if the original time I formed these connections, these guys had to be synced. And otherwise I wouldn't have formed the connection. So essentially you're saying, well, once I've learned these things, but I don't want this guy to fire again if they're not synced. That's the whole point of it. The point is that I don't want this guy to say, well, I'm going to fire anyway, and I'm going to make you guys sync up, right?
No. The reset only happens in response to the post-synaptic firing.
Yeah,
so
but why did this guy fire if they weren't synced up?
Then it won't fire. So that means a grid cell, a grid cell that does not have nicely aligned oscillators, right? It's not a grid cell. It really doesn't fire much, right? And so it's just not a grid cell. Maybe it's messy with like one oscillator, so it might look like a band cell, right? But maybe it's actually completely silent because all of the oscillators cancel each other out perfectly, right? Destructive interference, right? That is all possible. Yeah. The grid cell is an ideal cell that has the phases of its different oscillators aligned in such a way that all these lines intersect.
But this my point here. I said, what if my grid cell became active? I just chose to make it an ion. So we're going to learn what that represents. Okay.
Right.
So it's the first location of a new object. And so I have 8 cells out here. And let's say I connect to all 8 cells. Right? Now that is representing that specific location. Those things are all in sync at that point in time. So that's what that grid cell is supposed to mean. Now, in the future, if I know where I am based on sensory input and I activate this grid cell, then yes, this grid cell should activate all these cells at the same time.
And where they go.
Yes.
Right.
But if I'm moving around, I'm someplace else in the world, and I move around and these 8 cells aren't perfectly aligned, then this cell shouldn't fire. I should not. It's not like I say, well, that's good enough. I'm firing, and I'm going to redo these guys.
But it won't fire.
So the only way to make it fire. My point is the only way for this fixing you're talking about goes on is if the grid cell is coming from some sort of more of a sensory or place cell type of.
No. It's just a self-correction mechanism.
But I won't be active unless I'm driven by something. I won't be driven by this if these aren't right.
I don't understand.
There's 2 ways a grid cell can be driven. One by some sensory input like a place cell, and the other is by looking at these oscillators. If the oscillators are not lined up, then this guy shouldn't fire. Right? So I'm not going to fire and then correct them because I shouldn't have fired.
Right.
The only way
I'm not talking about fixing a theta shift that is so large that the grid cell would not fire. I'm talking about realigning the theta oscillators that are part of a grid cell that fires pretty well, but has shifted just a little bit in the last 125 milliseconds. So we're not talking about making grid cell fire that don't have adequate.
But then.
This is a noise rejection mechanism.
Okay.
It's not
all right. So
fundamental.
Fine. Then you're basically saying, but I don't like this idea, I'll be honest, because then you're saying like, okay, I learned on all 8 of these things, but now 5 of them are good, and that's going to be good enough for me, and I'll tell the other 3 to go. Well, okay, that's basically saying, it's possible. That's not the way I was thinking about it, but I was talking from a capacity point of view. I want to start off by assuming that I'm going to make connections and they're all going to be good, and then I can figure out what to do about noise.
Right.
But I'm thinking about capacity issues. So imagine if I didn't assume that. Imagine I required all 8 to be perfect. Then this grid cell would occur 1 out of 2 million, or actually 1 out of 2, or actually be 1 out of 17 million.
Yeah.
Possible locations in the universe.
It's really hard to build.
So there's a couple of things here. One of the things you mentioned earlier was in one of those papers, the idea that perhaps there's a cell here and it's got multiple dendritic branches, and that there's a natural mechanism to force these dendritic branches to be 120 degrees apart. that the cell itself wants to do that.
Yeah, there is a Hebbian learning mechanism because it turns out that the total firing activity of the grid cell, the total firing activity over all time, gets maximized when the inputs are 60-degree intervals.
Yes. Okay. So my point, I'm only mentioning this is because when I think about a grid cell sampling from this population of bumps moving around, right? You got these 8 bumps that are going woo, and this guy's going to sample from them. How many is it going to sample? Well, there might be an additional mechanism that says, you know what, I'm not going to let you sample 2 that are close in phase because I want to find ones that are certain separated apart. So if there's 8 of them out there, I'm going to force you to stick to 3 or 4 because this mechanism is just going to just get rid of some. So there might be a way of sort of not letting this become a very specific cell. Otherwise, you could form 8 synapses, and this cell would only become, you got the noise from mine, this cell would only become active every once in a blue moon, which is a really, really big space. Right. It's essentially like, I'm only going to repeat once every 17 million times. Right. We don't really want that. That's not going to work. So there may be a way of forcing this in some sense to only do a subsampling of these guys that are roughly more than 20 degrees apart, ideally, or something like that. Right. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of stuff to think about here. I have one more point. It's just sort of related, but it's off topic. Unless you want to talk about this more.
Well, there's only one tiny point I wanted to make.
Sure.
That is a question also about capacity, so maybe you have some thoughts about it. And that is the interaction between orientation and direction.
Yeah. Yes.
So the problem being oscillators that are like 180 degrees apart, like where are they? So we
talked about this,
right? Do we think that we have both of those in here?
Well, we know from Hubel and Diesel and other recordings that if you go down in the mini column, there's an orientation preference. Almost all the cells, not all of them, but almost all of them, have a directional sensitivity, and there's some going one way and there's some going the other way. Right. So within a mini column, you see both.
Right.
Now I didn't work that into this part. I thought about it. Oh, that's too much to think about right now. So because what you want is that would basically, you want this swim lane to behave differently. I don't know what the hell you want it to do actually. I wasn't able to figure that out yet.
So
I didn't incorporate that yet. You haven't thought of how to incorporate that yet?
Yes, I do. And actually, it already works with the exact same architecture. So the point that the hybrid grid cell model has, right, where there's
I know why you want this. The question is, how does it work in this picture here?
Yes, I understand. I'm going to explain it in this picture. The hybrid grid cell model that I presented, right, the Neil Burgess one, the 2014 paper, right, had 6 VCOs because they just chose 3 different orientations. So maybe they chose, horizontal.
120 degrees apart.
Yeah, exactly. So 120. So they had 6 because 6 different directions.
Yeah.
In this case, it would only be 3.
Yeah.
But that's not a problem because the hybrid model also says that the oscillator in a direction and the opposite direction, when you have all 6, need to be in phase. The cool thing about the swim lane model is that is guaranteed. So the only little augmentation to this model is that this is not really one connection. This is actually a pair of oscillators. So there's 3 pairs.
Yeah, okay, so basically you're saying I have to have, but then that gets weird because if I have a forward oscillator and a backwards oscillator, that means wouldn't I have 2 different wavefronts moving across here?
Well, it's maybe one wavefront, but one is preceding and the other one is, recessing.
That would be 2, right?
Yeah, but the shift will be absolutely minor. Keep in mind.
Oh, right, shift. I'm just trying to visualize this. Maybe clear in your head. It's not clear in my
head. At maximum mouse speed of 40 centimeters per second or something, right? Maximum rodent speed, right?
Yeah.
The change in theta is something like 0.5 hertz, 0.3, 0.5, something on that order, right? So that means that compared to the whole theta cycle of 125 milliseconds, you are now a 16th of that earlier or later. It's actually a very small fraction. compared to the 8 cells that you have, that's not even a half cell difference.
Yeah.
Right? So it's not like the peaks are going to be in radically different places, just that one is slightly ahead.
Well, no, but if you go over time, they separate.
Yes, but the cool thing is, as soon as they make a grid cell fire, it resets to the same phase anyways. It's this whole system.
But then I'm not getting rid of noise. Now I'm getting rid of information. I need to be able to path integrate differently in one direction versus the backwards direction. And if I sync them up all the time, I've lost that. I've lost my differentiation between forward and backwards. It's almost as if I would have to have 2 VCO oscillators here. One is increasing its frequencies, one decreasing its frequencies. But I can't resync them because then I've lost everything.
Hold on. The VCOs only need to path integrate until they make the grid cell fire. After that, the path integration is in the grid cell. So
I don't buy that point. Again, I think maybe I'm wrong about this. This idea that every time imagine what has to happen here is that this system, take out the grid cells for a moment. Just take out the grid cells. The VCOs have to basically do a path integration system that works from a point in some direction. I move. I have to be able to represent where I am in the new space.
Right.
And that has to work independently of grid cells until the grid cells are just reading out from that, and the grid cells can reestablish this when I have sensory data. But before that happens, I cannot be resetting these guys. These guys they're doing their path integration, and I cannot reset them at all until I've finished my movement. I
don't understand. I don't follow that argument. Why? Because
otherwise they stop path integrating.
The integration is just in the grid cells.
But the point is the grid cell is not required to do path integration. The grid cell is a readout. It doesn't. If the readout changes the path integrator, then I've lost my path integration. So imagine this whole system should work before any grid cells fire. It's just basically
it's that insistence on that it works completely without grid cells. Essentially,
it does.
It explains why you think there's a need for this to keep going forever without theta resets.
But obviously, keep going forever. But
until the end of the navigation.
Until the noise, right? The noise is a big problem. But take the noise out of the moment. Yes, the theoretical idea is that you have to keep path integrating as you move until. And the point is, at any point in time in the future, there will always be some synchronous set of cells here. There's always going to be some synchronous set of cells. I don't need a grid cell module to read it out, but if I did, it's just going to read out that synchronous set of cells. And that grid cell module, if it's ever going to make something happen again, it's going to make those same cells active again. So it can't change. It can't. If I'm constantly changing these phases here, then it's not going to work.
But that is exactly what is required in the oscillatory interference model for it to work. Every time you need to reset the phase because otherwise these things decohere, right?
Yes. But they do cohere in the sense that they noise, right? It's a noise issue. They just get lost. Is that right?
No, in this case, I mean, in general, yes, but in this particular case of the different directions, which is a peculiar problem, in this particular case, it's just always true that when you move in one direction, you're not moving in the opposite direction.
Okay, so all right, fine. So, I'm with you here. I think all this works if there's 2 VCOs in here, and one represents forward and one represents backward,
right.
But then I will have 2 frequencies, and those frequencies have to be maintained, going both ways. I'm good with that. But the idea that if there's 2 separate frequencies and I constantly put them back in the phase every single step of the time, then I guess this doesn't make sense. I can't do
not every step at a time. Only when you've integrated the path.
Yeah, but I'm with that too. I'm with that too. But the point is, the grid cell the grid cells remember to state when they're all in phase, and the grid cell should only be reinstating states that when they're all in phase. It should not be reinstating states to say, you're at point X, but you're not reading it. I know we're at point X, so I'm just going to force it upon you. that only happens if I'm given my sensory data. I think maybe I'll read this paper again. Maybe you can point to the exact point where they're talking about this again.
Yes, I can. Yes.
I'm not with you yet, Jeremy. You might be right, but I still think this is an issue here. One thing, an interesting question. I just had a thought. So we have the cells that are measured by Hubel and Wiesel clearly show, okay, same orientation. One cell becomes active going this way, one cell becomes active going that way. Very different. It's not clear to me yet that that I need two VCOs. For example, well.
You don't see the mathematical need?
No, I'm trying. No, it's more of a functional need.
Why these are pairs?
I want to think about it. I'm gonna go back to it.
But I mean, I can echo your sentiment that the only reason we need quote unquote these to have some that respond to one direction and some to the other is to match Hubel and Wiesel. We could have a path integrating system with this picture right here without that.
You could, but it would not have theta precession irrespective of the direction that you grid from. Like the reason that Neil Burgess did this implementation with this opposite pair is otherwise you can't explain why theta is always precessing.
Yeah,
maybe you can do a calculation without that. Maybe theta precession is not happening.
Maybe what I need to do here is this whole idea that there's 8 sets of these that are equivalent, and also the idea of the precession. I have not worked that into this yet. And I don't even know where precession, I don't even know how to think about precession in this yet. I need to get there. So maybe I need to read that Burgess paper again and think about precession, think about how, maybe that's the next step. Like what does precession mean here? I just no idea. I have no way of connecting that idea with this idea. And maybe I need to do that. That would be a good next step for me. And then that might resolve our misunderstandings or confusion about these two things here. So let me take that as a step. I want to talk about one more thing, if you don't mind.
I'm done. I think I've said everything.
No, we don't, because we could argue forever. I just think one more thing, and maybe this will be a little bit more meaningful for Marcus, because he's been through this multiple times. And this is just a partial idea. This is a picture of Cortex now. This is thalamus. So these are 3 thalamic relay cell regions. And Michelangelo and Florida, you know if you've seen these.
Yeah, first order cortex.
That's right. So one thing we've always struggled with is, okay, we say cortex is cortex, and there's a common algorithm between the thalamic relay cells and the corresponding cortical region. And so the classic view is you have sensory data that's coming in from your senses. It goes to the first order relay cells in the thalamus, goes to cortex. Layer 5 cells in cortex project out to someplace subcortically, which is a motor-related thing, but the same cell acts on splits. And that becomes the input to the next relay, which goes up to here. And so this has always been a problem, because if you accept this view, then why would these relay cells be doing the sensory data here, and these would be doing motor data here? And so that was this problem. How can the thalamic relay cells represent sense features in the primary nucleus, but motor commands in higher order nuclei? That is inconsistent with the common algorithm. So one solution we propose, which I'm not abandoning yet, but it's the solution we propose, is that it's possible that the layer 5 cells are alternating on every phase of a cycle between a motor behavior and a feature or a object of pose type of
so it's multiplexing its axon.
Yes. And there's some evidence that this would be occurring. And when we thought about the displacement cells in the way that the original incarnation of displacement cells, and I remember when Scott was here, he first explained it to me, but it might have been your idea. I don't know, Marcus. But the idea is that when you form a representational location and then the next location that there's a transition between like, oh, I'm going from location in space 1 to another location in space 1, then it flips to being a location in space 2. And so you'd have these two different representations. One is more of object representation, one's more of a motor representation. And so that was our solution we proposed. They alternate peaks of size between feature and motor. This view that I've been promoting recently, it provides a twist on this that maybe we haven't thought about yet. I haven't thought about that. In the sense that I'm now arguing that from the retina, you're getting, these things are not just features, they are direction and velocity vectors. And so we'll call that, instead of motor, we'll call that a movement of some sort. And this is a movement that's being sensed from the sensory organs. And so, and then if you think about it as movement, then you say, okay, well, then let's say this is not a motor command coming out of layer 5, but it's a similar representation. It represents direction and speed. And so that is perceptual cortically, but then that becomes the movement vector into the next region. So this whole thing would be consistent if I had movement, everything is a movement vector. Of course, that leaves some other questions. So that's a new idea that I've been promoting now for over several months, and I haven't really spelled it out this way, but that we're actually the core driver for the primary regions of the cortex in terms of knowing how you're moving in the world, how your sensors are moving in the world, is basically coming from the sensors, not from the motor commands subcortically, but actually from your sensor data, which is later correlated with subcortical motor behavior. So this is a learned thing. This is a sense thing, and then this is a learned relationship. This brings up, so I like that. Oh, that's kind of nice. All of a sudden, I can put the same words on these lines here. But then it says, well, what about the actual things I'm sensing? There must be something I'm sensing that's not just movement. I need to sense some feature in the world to build up my model of objects. I don't want to just know where I am. I don't want to just know that I'm moving over here, moving over there. I need to sense something. So where is that coming from? It's clearly going to come from the sensor organ as well. So the question is, one possible answer is the sense feature and the movement are somehow coincident. I don't know what that means, but maybe the data coming from, there's multiple streams of data coming from sensory organs through the thalamus, and they're separated in the thalamus. And I haven't looked at it I haven't looked at that data with the idea, could one be actually representing movement and one be representing some sort of more spatial feature? Another idea is, consistent with this is this idea here that when I say feature, again, it's like feature plus pose, as Marcus was saying, that we have this direct, I should say, we have this sort of direct connection here between regions. That could be the feature pose, this could be the movement. Now I have a real explanation for that. But then you say, what's the equivalent here? And it says basically then, well, I guess I've answered it already, that there are sort of two channels coming from the sensor, but we don't have a direct sensor. We don't have a direct channel. That doesn't exist. If I had a direct channel from here to here, I would be thrilled because it's like a direct channel from here to here. Right. But I don't have that. We don't see that. So the only alternate is somehow that either the same signal, I guess the two answers here, either the same fibers are representing both, maybe at different phases, I don't know, or there's two sets of fibers going in and two sets of fibers coming out, but then that doesn't explain why it goes to the thalamus, where here it goes direct. So the idea that the way to think about this input is movement makes it all consistent. But then I've taken the problem from here being like, this has to alternate between feature and motor. And I said, no, I don't have to do that anymore. This is feature, this is motor. But then I have the problem over here. The problem over here says, well, where's my feature and motor separated type of thing. So I don't know, it was an interesting idea to play around with. But I still, again, if I saw something that was like this, I would be thrilled. I would say, okay, that's it. Of course, that's a parallel to this, but we don't see that. At least I'm not aware of it. So, and I just thought that, throw that out. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, Marcus, given we talked about this so many times.
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that I do have thoughts. No, in the sense that it doesn't connect to this very well. This whole explanation of why Cortex is projecting something that's like kind of motory, kind of sensory, think I have a different spin on it, but I don't know if you want to hear it right now.
If you think it would be helpful, I want to hear
Well,
it.
just like I can put it pretty quickly that okay, animals can do a lot without a cortex.
Yes.
In a sense, there's a whole behaving animal already there,
Yes.
and then there's a cortex on top
Yeah.
of it. So what is cortex doing? You could say that cortex gives us the ability to sense higher level things like democracy, or like just democracy is an exaggerated or a hardcore version of it. But there are things out there in the world that we can't sense with our sensors because there are multiple levels removed, and multiple levels of analysis removed. Cortex is giving us the ability to sense those things, and the thing that's being output here isn't a movement. It's just another feature that the cortex is letting the rest of your brain now respond to.
But that's not what it looks. It looks like it is. These things really are movement related.
It's projecting to areas that then execute motor movements. But that's
Well, I think in some sense I agree with your meta-analysis, but I also feel like without a cortex, most animals would not perceive the structure of even basic objects very well. That as an animal without a cortex would not be able to see necessarily objects on this table as separate objects and recognize them. The closest analogy I can come to is, if I hear someone speaking Russian, I don't even hear the words. It's just,
You don't even know where they stop and stop.
Right. It's just like all I can pick. It's just there's no structure to it. And there occasionally we run into physical things in the world like that. I've noticed in my lifetime, but it's very rare that you see something that is usually it's some sort of optical illusion, but you just look and go, I can't even parse this. I can't even begin where the boundaries are. So I think it's required for even learning the most basic structure in the world, where you can eat something by saying, I know the thing I want to eat is over there, and I don't really know exactly its state or its position, and I don't really understand all the things around it. It doesn't really matter. I'm just going to eat that thing over there. And I don't really realize that maybe there's a rock in between, I can move the rock or something like that. These things are beyond that animal. So I think it's required to learn even the most basic structure of the world, to see things, even the most basic things, to feel and know things, the most basic things.
I'm not contradicting that.
Yeah, well, it's to say like it's high level things. So I think the idea that, I think when the cortex is using a smartphone.
Sure, maybe it was a mistake for me to start with democracy.
Yeah.
But like V1 also has these outputs, like the most basic.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking like if I use something like a smartphone, every small movement related to the phone is controlled. Not the final part, which is the cerebellum, but pretty close to the final part is going to be cortex. And it's like, yes, to manipulate the smartphone, I have to move my finger to the upper left-hand corner, then touch this, then do that, then pull this thing down. And so I think that even the most, objects, a stapler, a scissor, a smartphone requires the cortex to have a motor system to manipulate the object. I don't know what that, in terms of vision, it's not like that. In terms of vision, you're basically just controlling where your eyes are moving. But anyway, okay, let's leave it at that. There's a new thing for me to think about here that we can understand the output of the retina as being movement vectors, just in the way we reinterpret Hubble and Wiesel cells are really velocity and direction. And there's lots of others. Again, I want to remind you, there's so many other cells that they could not get the response specifically to the stimulus. They were trying, and the only time they got the first success they had was when they had a moving edge, and then they built on that. So basically, everyone's built this entire economy about detecting these moving edges, and those are roughly 50% of the cells or 40% of the cells. So the other 50% of the cells are doing something else, and they might be, it's interesting. Would we find those voltage control oscillators? Do we find cells in cortex that look like, that behave like this? This is that from that picture, right? That paper. We have these theta oscillations in there. Anyway, rambling. Okay, that's it. Thanks, Matt.
That was a ranging discussion today.
Yeah. So I'm going to read that Which religious paper was that?
Thanks for watching, everybody.
The hybrid